Starting with Home Assistant Release 2022.9, there's going to be a major change in the way your MQTT entities are defined in YAML. I'm going to show you those changes, how to update your YAML, and why this particular change has driven me to move to Home Assistant packages. So hang around. If you take a look at the release notes for the current version of Home Assistant, which is 2022.6 as of the time of this recording, under Breaking Changes, which I always recommend you look at, you'll notice a pretty big change for MQTT. Now, I say a pretty big change if you're using manual MQTT entities in your YAML. If not, you probably don't care about this section, but if you're still interested in seeing how I talk about migrating to Home Assistant packages, you can use the links down here in the video timeline to jump ahead to that part. But I want to start out by talking about these changes to MQTT in your YAML. So let's start out by taking a look at the way you currently define MQTT entities in YAML. Over here, you can see that you have your entity type, switch, sensor. Underneath that, you have a platform of MQTT. After 2022.9, MQTT is now considered a root level integration. So you would have MQTT, then underneath that you would have your entity type such as switch or sensor and define your devices there. Now if you're using a split configuration, and I'll talk about that in a minute, it would look something like this. You would have a switches.yaml file with your platform of MQTT underneath that, and then you would probably have a sensors.yaml file and so on for all of your MQTT entities. In the new version, you're now going to have something like an MQTT YAML file, and within that, you're going to have all of your switches, sensors, lights defined. Now, there's another way to tackle this with include statements, and I'll talk about that as well in just a few minutes. But first, let's take a look at actually migrating a couple of MQTT entities from the old version to the new. So odds are, if you've been using YAML for a while, and probably why you're watching this video, at some point in time, you've probably split out your configuration file. And what I mean by that, instead of putting everything in your main configuration.yaml file, you've split out individual YAML files, usually by entity type, such as lights, switches, input booleans, and then in your main configuration.yaml, you just use an include statement to bring those files in. So for our new MQTT, we're going to follow the same process. I'm going to split all those out into their own YAML file. So to begin with, we're going to create a new file. I just call mine mqtt.yaml. So once we have the file created, we do need to come over to our main configuration.yaml file, and we need to have another include statement in here. As a top level integration, we're going to include our new mqtt.yaml file. We need to save that, check our configuration, and restart Home Assistant. So let's take a look at actually moving a couple of these YAML entries from the old MQTT platform to the new MQTT integration. On the left-hand side here is my current original YAML. Again, you'll see platform MQTT. I'm going to move a couple of lights here as an example. And again, these are Tasmota devices that were added well before the Tasmota integration. So the previous way you did that was through MQTT. Over here is my new MQTT YAML file. I went ahead and created sections for all the type of MQTT entries that I've got: binary sensors, lights, sensors, and switches. And again, I've created these sections to try to maintain some kind of organization and make it easy to find things. But the first step is we're just going to take this first light and we're going to copy and paste it. Now, the reason I want to copy and paste is I don't want to lose anything here. I want to keep this temporarily. We're going to comment this out. First, I've got to come over here and fix this. Well, first of all, we no longer have a platform MQTT. Instead, we're going to start out with name. And now we need to indent each of these by 2 spaces. And yes, I know this would be much easier using something like Video Studio Editor or something like that, but I wanted to show this just using the default Home Assistant editor. It was relatively that easy. It just takes a lot of time and effort, and there's a lot of room for error in terms of your YAML spacing and that kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and save this. But now, before we can try that out, I need to come back over here and I need to comment out all of these lines. Otherwise, you end up with the device defined twice, once the old way and once the new way, and come release 2022.9, this way will no longer be supported. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We're going to save that, check our configuration, and restart Home Assistant again. Now let's go over and let's check, for one thing, our Home Assistant control of that device, and that still works as well. And now we will go over and actually check the switch itself to make sure that that works. And we see that that does. So our first light move was successful. Right now we have a mixed mode of still the old MQTT and the new MQTT. So let's go back and move the other light. Okay, so back in our editor again. Now that I know that this is working, I can go ahead and remove all of these comment lines out of the original file. And now we need to move this second light. And we just repeat the same process as we did for the first one. We're going to copy and paste and then indent. And once again, using a different text editor like Video Studio Code or whatever your favorite editor is would make this a lot easier, because it's going to let you do block inserts of spaces or block inserts of your comments, and it would be a lot quicker with an external editor, especially if you have a lot of these to do like I do. Okay, and once again, we've got to go back now and remember to comment the old one out. Okay, so we're going to save both files, go back and do our check and restart Home Assistant. And so once again, we're going to go back over to our Home Assistant Lovelace, or I guess they call it dashboard now. And we're going to double check to make sure that our lights still work here. And we're going to go up as well, and we're going to check the physical switch. And since this happens to be a four-way switch situation, I'm going to go ahead and check the other switches as well before I go back and remove those comments from the old light.yaml file. So if you only have a handful of MQTT entities, you can make these migrations pretty easy and be ready to go for the September release or the .9 release of Home Assistant, when the old MQTT will become obsolete and no longer work. But if you're like me, I have literally hundreds of MQTT entities defined in YAML. In fact, I currently have 209 of them, which I've had to log into a spreadsheet in preparation for this migration. Now you might be asking, why do I have so many MQTT entities? Well, one reason is the fact that I have a lot of Tasmota devices that were created and integrated before the native Tasmota integration, and you used to have to do those via MQTT. In addition, I have a number of devices that I've written my own code and integrated into Home Assistant via MQTT, whether it be one of a number of different clocks that I've written, or my parking assistant, or maybe my virtual window. These all integrate to Home Assistant with MQTT and create a number of switches, sensors, and other entities that do not have native integrations, and the only way to get them into Home Assistant is through MQTT. So not only is this going to be a huge amount of work, it's also going to lead to another problem in terms of how my configuration files are organized. Now I do use a split configuration like we just talked about, and each of my entity types that are defined in YAML are defined in their own YAML file. Lights can be found in the lights.yaml, switches can be found in the switches.yaml, and so on. But now any of those entities that are MQTT have to be brought out into their own file, so I end up with something like this. I still have all of my normal non-MQTT entities in their own file, but anything that's MQTT has to be split out into its own file. So now if I go to look for something like a sensor, I might have to look in two places, sensors.yaml if it's a non-MQTT sensor, but then I have to go to mqtt.yaml to find the sensor if it is. So this already makes things less organized. So the next option might be to split out my mqtt.yaml file using a series of include statements. Yes, you can nest include statements just like you do in your configuration.yaml. So in this case, instead of having all of my entities defined here, I'm going to split all of those out into a separate YAML file. But even doing that, I still end up with something like this. Now, every entity type, again, has two files, the non-MQTT version and the MQTT version. So I still have to potentially search two different files to find an entity if I can't remember whether it's an MQTT entity or not. So no matter how I decide to configure this, I'm going to end up with something that's less organized and less usable than I had before. So I figured if I have to go ahead and migrate 209 MQTT entities anyway, it was a good time to take a look at a different organizational scheme. To do that, I'm going to look at Home Assistant packages. So what do we mean by packages in Home Assistant? Well, packages are a different way of organizing and grouping your configuration files. To understand that and see how we get started, let's take a look at the default configuration.yaml file. So here's a really simple example of a configuration.yaml file. There will be other things in this configuration file, but what we're interested in are these top-level native integrations. Things like automations, scripts, sensors, lights, anything you do in YAML have to fall underneath these individual headers or integrations that are left justified in your configuration file. Now, we can use include files. That way we can kind of divide this up and organize it a little bit more. So for example, if we look at binary sensors, I can go over to my binary sensors.yaml file, which is included, and you can see I have all of my binary sensors defined here. But note that binary sensors with a colon is not repeated in this file. In fact, what Home Assistant does behind the scenes is they take your include file and drops it in underneath this, so all of your binary sensors are still appearing here. We can't repeat these sections anywhere else. Well, at least we couldn't until you consider Home Assistant packages. Packages allow you to take these multiple entities and combine them together all in one file. So I can have a file that consists of automations and scripts and binary sensors and input booleans all in one file. Might be around a particular automation, might be around a particular entity, might be around a particular room in my home. The best way to understand this is take a look at an example. So this is a current automation I have for my stair lights. Again, it consists of multiple automations all in one file that's included, but up here in the comments, you'll see that other entities are involved in this automation. There's a light entity, a couple of binary sensors, timer, and 3 input booleans. Now, if I want to go work on this and I need to look up the input boolean, I've got to go out to my input boolean.yaml file or out to my timer file. Or if these were defined with YAML, to my light.yaml, my binary sensor. So there could be 4 or 5 separate YAML files involved in turning those stair lights off and on. So what packages are going to do is going to allow me to bring these other YAML entries into a single file that all works together. Here is this same thing around my stair lights, but this is in a package called stairlight.yaml. Now, in this case, now I'm down to only 3 entities that aren't part of this that are used, and again, it's because they aren't defined in YAML. The light is WLED integration and the binary sensors come from ESP Home. But you can see where I've now brought my timer into this file. Again, I've repeated that top header that we weren't able to repeat before. Here are my 3 input booleans, and then down here are all of my rest of my automations. This is a pretty simple example. You might have something that also involves automations that call a script, and that script might use input numbers, and you can bring all those together into one file and organize your Home Assistant around packages. And I think the use of packages is going to help me do a little more organization with all those MQTT entities I just discussed a little bit ago. Taking a look at just a shell of a sample package file, again, you can see I can define my sensors and my switches, but now I can have an MQTT section and bring those particular sensors or switches at least into the same file instead of having them separated out in a bunch of different files. Now do note that you don't have to go all or none. I can still maintain a sensor.yaml file and I can have a sensor section in my different packages. The only thing is you can't repeat a name. If I have my sensor 1 defined here in my package, I can't have a my sensor 1 also defined in my sensors.yaml file. I also want to give a quick shout out here to Jeff over at Slacker Labs. He kind of helped me get started with the idea of packages, and he does some amazing things with YAML that I didn't even know was possible. He also makes all of his configuration package files available online, so you might want to check out his channel. I'll leave a link down below if you want to see more examples of how you might use packages. Okay, to begin using packages, the first thing you want to do is go ahead and create you a new folder. I'm calling mine packages. You can call it whatever you want. Just remember what that name is. We'll create that. Come down here, double check, make sure we've got our new packages folder. Then we need to open up our main configuration.yaml file. In here we have to include an include statement, but note that this must be indented by 2 spaces. Maybe somebody can tell me down in the comments why, but if you left align this like you do your other include statements, Home Assistant is going to throw an error about packages not being an integration. So this isn't a true integration, but if you indent that 2 spaces, then include a dir named and the name of your folder, in this case packages, it will allow you to create multiple package YAML files in that folder, and they will be brought into your configuration. So again, you can organize your packages in any kind of groupings that you want. I will probably group mine around my automations, as those tend to already be grouped by a device or group of devices that work together. For example, my matrix clock has dozens of automations, but also makes use of dozens of switches and sensors. So it would make sense to bring that all into one package. And just another quick tips about if you do move to packages, as long as your scripts and automations still have a unique ID, you are still able to use the debugger for automations and scripts, even though that they're in packages. And as well, you're still able to load or reload individual parts of Home Assistant, say input booleans, for example, without a complete restart. Now, don't get me wrong. The move from a split configuration over to Home Assistant packages is no small undertaking, especially if you have hundreds of automations and scripts and YAML-defined entities. But hopefully the end result will be worth it with a much better organized system. And the good news is you don't have to do it all at once. You can slowly move things to packages while you leave the rest of your Home Assistant configuration intact. Well, that is, unless you have 209 MQTT entities that all have to be migrated by September. But at least the fine wizards over at Home Assistant has given me 3 months to do that. And I figure with my luck, about September, they're going to announce the depreciation of packages, and I'll have to move everything back to a split configuration. But such are the joys of being a Home Assistant user and breaking changes. So that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully, if you're like me and you've got a number of MQTT defined entities in YAML, or you've ever thought about moving to Home Assistant packages, something in this video might have helped you out. If so, hit that like button. That lets both me and YouTube know that more people ought to see this video. If you'd like to see some of my other videos, hit that subscribe button and ding that little bell icon if you want to be notified when I release new videos. As always, I would like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.